What's up everybody, Matt Moran here for another car review. This is the 1992 Subaru SVX. Huge thanks to Alex for providing me here with his very nice SVX to review for you guys today. So about the SVX, well, it was this crazy idea from Subaru where they wanted to compete with all the luxury performance coupes of the day, even though Subaru at that time was just building basic economy transportation essentially. And it was just this wild thing. And I mean, it's wild with its styling too. It was designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, who does, the styling for the DeLorean, the BMW M1, and all kinds of iconic designs. And so, I mean, it looks like that. I mean, it looks very, very impressive. I mean, one thing you can see that you saw from stuff like the DeLorean are the window within a window side treatment, which is probably the most distinctive feature of this car. But before we get to that, I mean, even up front there, it was very streamlined, and this one has these driving lights installed. But if it didn't have those, you just have like a light bar across the middle of the grille there. But it's a really cool look combined with, the mud flaps here and the roof rack. He's kind of made it this winter warrior kind of setup, and it looks really cool like that. But these things, by the way, only had a drag coefficient of 0.29. So, I mean, you really see just how low this hood is, which is possible thanks to that Subaru Boxer engine having that very low positioning there. But it just really gives us a distinctive style, even for stuff in the 90s. It was all very streamlined and, smooth. But yeah, that side profile is really the big thing. You have the window within a window, and it's wild how much of it is actually glass. It's not like other cars these days, have stuff that tricks you into thinking it's glass, but it's just painted black or something. Most of what you're seeing here is actual glass, and the way that they brought it all the way up to the roof line there with just basically one seam is impressive. It really gives this a very sleek look that almost makes you think that the entire roof is glass. It isn't, but it looks, very close to it. And I love how it's kind of a two-tone thing too, back whenever no one was really doing two-tone stuff, in the 90s. And so just a really cool look there, and that goes into the rear deck lid there. This one does not have that optional spoiler that many SVXs do have, but you still have that big, full width taillight back there, back whenever, again, they were trying to bring that in as like a futuristic thing, which we're now seeing a resurgence of here in the 2020s. But, the SVX was doing it here 30 years ago, and it's just so cool how you have that, it's not a continuous light bar in the back there, but it looks like it, and has, the SVX logo even in the middle of it there. Just so distinctive from every single angle here with the styling on the SVX. And so overall, I think it's just a super cool vehicle that's actually aged very well too, as far as the styling, in my opinion. The interior of the SVX is also just as interesting as the outside in a lot of ways. So you'll see one thing here with the early 90s vehicles, you have this automatic shoulder belt that, is just hanging out here until you actually start up the vehicle. But other than that, I mean, it's just a super cool interior with the way these seats, you have these nice bucket seats here that really actually have some nice bolstering to them here. I mean, it's nothing crazy, especially by modern performance car standards, but especially the thigh bolstering is really nice the way it hugs you in and you kind of sink down in these seats here. But I mean, just the view with these massive windows, it gives you just this super airy cabin. This one also is the LSL, so you have the sunroof here as well, which has a little bit of a cover over it unless you open it up there. But if you have that opened up, then you'll have an extra airy experience. And just so cool too with the way that you have like this wraparound dash here that kind of sinks down, and you have this two-piece thing here for the passenger side of the dash and how that sweeps into the doors. It's all just so cool. The steering wheel is actually one of the least exceptional things here about the vehicle. It's just, a basic Subaru wheel for the most part here, but it has a really nice 9-3 grip and little 10-2 notches, and it's actually a nice, thin wheel, and, feels really good to use so far. The gauges are also pretty typical Subaru stuff. They're a little more futuristic than your average Subaru of the day, with those little digital readouts there in the upper corners. But otherwise, those analog gauges, anyone who's familiar with any Subaru from the 90s will feel right at home looking at those gauges. And then coming over to the center here, it's pretty minimalistic, especially with all these hideaway panels. It looks really straightforward. You just have your climate controls out here in the open, which is so cool that in 1992 you had auto climate controls and you had a little digital controller here for that temperature. And obviously, this wasn't crazy new tech at this time, and there's been stuff from the 80s from General Motors and stuff that had all these types of things, but really cool to see that. It's one of the things that certainly made it feel more, high end. And anyway, behind that hideaway panel, you'll see not only a cassette player and radio there, but also a CD player here that you have right underneath of it. And again, another nice thing that was also part of this touring package with the LSLs that you got. And so nice that you have that here. Again, makes it feel, pretty high end for a 1992 vehicle. I believe it's still just a 6-speaker setup, so nothing crazy, but still a nice improvement over, I believe, the standard 4-speaker setup you used to have have on regular SVXs. And otherwise, though, you just have your cigarette lighter and ashtray combo like you had in the 90s. And you also have a very interesting setup here for the shifter, which has a manual mode, which is very cool, although it's basically, you know, pretty limited and just kind of removes some of the slush from the 1 to 2 shift. But anyway, you have that. You also have this very interesting handbrake handle here, which looks like another shifter, but cool to have that. The only thing about having it there is that you have no cup holders in any of the usual spots. You do have like a tack-on cup holder over here on this side. That's kind of interesting, kind of hilarious, honestly, but that's all you got as far as cup holders go. So not great from a livability standpoint, but you do have a coin holder here. So at least you have that if you're planning on paying with change. Otherwise, though, you have this little armrest, and all the plastics in here, obviously being 30 years old, are a little squeaky and loose, but it does have some padding to it, and, you know, it's pretty nice for its time. And you open that up and you'll see a nice little cubby there. Nothing huge, but really nice. And so, you know, aside from the lack of abundant cup holders, which was a typical thing, you know, in cars in this time period, you didn't have, you know, a ton of cup holders, if any at all. So nice to at least have one. But aside from that, I mean, it's a really comfortable interior. And again, it's just so impressive from an airy standpoint with all this glass. And again, if you're in that back seat, which is a tight back seat, I'm 5'9", me sitting behind myself, I can only fit if my legs are spread out there and my head is basically up against the ceiling there. So I wouldn't want to sit back there for too long, but I do just barely fit at 5'9". And anyway, I mean, just you'll have more rear visibility than any other coupe I think I've ever sat in the back seat of. I mean, with that, all that glass there, it really is a nice experience if you do fit back there. And you also see they even have their own little ashtray back there too, which is nice. And yeah, so as long as your passengers are children, they'll fit, or if it be very small adults to actually take advantage of that ashtray. But just a funny inclusion there. But overall, yeah, still just a very nice interior in my opinion. Trunk space in the SVX is also pretty good for a coupe. I mean, you know, it's a pretty wide space, has a nice tall opening, so you're able to, you know, get things in and out pretty easily. It also has folding rear seats here if you need a little bit of extra practicality. But overall, just a really good sized trunk for a coupe. But let's start up and go for a drive. Of course, the SVX here still has a normal key, but amazingly, actually, I'm pretty surprised. For 1992, it has keyless entry. It's just one button to both lock and unlock it, but it has keyless entry in 92. I honestly didn't think any vehicles back then had this, so I learned something new today. But anyway, of course, you just slip the key into the slot here, and you have these come over your shoulder there. It's just always a fun experience if you haven't experienced that before. And anyway, it starts right up and runs really smooth. You'll even notice it's like really quiet in here, and it's pretty impressive just how luxury car it feels whenever it's just sitting here idling. Alright, so setting off here in the 1992 Subaru SVX. Well, growing up as a Subaru WRX fan, I you know, always thought these were really cool and always wanted to drive one, and I've never driven one until today. And so, first things you notice about the SVX here, I'll say the first thing is it has just, you know, the wonderful preciseness of a naturally aspirated engine with an actual cable throttle. It just, you know, gives you this direct feeling you don't get in modern cars. That really is the first thing that jumped out at me. Another thing is you have a brake pedal that doesn't really do much for the first half of its travel. Also kind of typical of the time, especially one that's, you know, a little bit more worn out. This one has 136,000 miles on it. Great condition, but, you know, just some of those components, you know, might not be quite as tight as they were when they were brand new. Same thing goes for the steering. It's, you know, a tiny bit loose, but honestly, it still feels really nice and direct. And here for the ones with these touring package on these top trims, you actually had speed-sensitive steering, which was supposedly more precise and dynamic than the engine-sensitive steering that you had on the lower trims. And so, obviously I don't have a lower trim to compare, but I'll take their word for it, and I just gotta say that it just feels very just nice and direct, you know, especially considering the time period. Just feels really good. And this whole ride too just feels so smooth and comfortable. It really does feel luxurious, and I think they hit that mark from, you know, way back then. I mean, you know, obviously there's probably some stuff that was even floatier than this back then, but it's just really comfortable while still giving you a really good handling feel as well, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. But it's also pretty quiet. We're going up a hill now, but whenever the engine's just kind of, you know, cruising, I was even doing a little bit of highway cruising a few minutes ago, it's just amazing how quiet it is. And these tires are probably the noisiest thing, honestly, because this has Blizzaks on it, because we are filming this here in winter, but it's one of these bizarre winter days in Pittsburgh where it's 63 degrees. So they're making extra noise than they normally would. But I'm going to turn down onto this back road here. I'm just going to leave it in drive. I'm not going to try and do anything fancy. I'm just going to leave it in drive and turn down onto this back road and see how it does. And here we go. Nice and responsive. Wow. And it actually had this power light that illuminated whenever I floored it. So I guess it recognized I wanted, you know, some sportier response out of it. So I think it actually kind of held the gear intelligently there and made sure that I got the power I was looking for. So, and speaking of the power, it has a 3.3 liter flat 6 Boxer 6 engine. It does 230 horsepower and 228 pound-feet of torque, which for 1992 standards was pretty impressive out of something, you know, that didn't have a turbocharger on it. And so 0 to 60 times weren't crazy fast. That was partially just because of it being slowed down by this 4-speed automatic that you have. So 0 to 60 times, I think Subaru claimed 6.9 seconds. Testing showed that it was closer to about an 8-second 0 to 60. But, you know, it's strong power. It wasn't the fastest thing of its day. It wasn't supposed to be either. It was supposed to be more on the luxurious side. But for a, you know, powerful luxury coupe, it certainly, you know, has a good amount of acceleration. Obviously, these days, there's much faster stuff, you know, for way less money. But I think it's, you know, solid performance, and it's enough to have fun with. Supposedly, now these only came with an automatic, but some people have swapped manuals into them. Supposedly with a 5-speed manual, this thing is a whole nother animal, and I would love to try one of those someday. But, you know, so far, it's just, you know, nice and responsive. This automatic too, you know, even though it is the very old Subaru 4-speed, it does a pretty good job of, you know, giving me the response and the power that I'm looking for. And the whole vehicle just, you know, drives exactly like how you want it to. It doesn't do anything weird or unexpected. It just gives you what you're looking for and does it in a predictable manner. And so it's really good from that standpoint. But we're coming up some corners here that I always take, and let's see how the SVX handles. Now it's on Blizzak, so I'll have to cut a little bit of an extra brake here. But here we go. All right, it really kind of dives into the corner there. It has a little bit of lean, but then it sets in and really like commits itself, and it just gives you very flat handling. And it's really impressive. And it almost feels like, you know, you go to turn in, and then you get a little bit of a delay, and then it actually slides around on you a little bit. That's probably some of the Blizzaks talking there as well, as far as the actual little bit of slidiness going on here. But it handles itself very, very well. You had a 4-wheel drive system, all-wheel drive, full-time all-wheel drive, as standard here in the SVXs. Now, they did make, in 1994 and 1995, you could have the option of front-wheel drive. That was a cost-cutting measure to try and bring the prices down on these. Wasn't very popular, pretty rare to even find a front-wheel drive SVX. So basically, most of the ones you'll see out there are all-wheel drive, and it's a 50-50 split for the all-wheel drive system whenever it's in the kind of scenario where it needs that. Otherwise, it can go up to 90% to the front. So still a front bias all-wheel drive system most of the time, but it's nice that it can do full 50-50. But yeah, these tires I think are certainly just letting me down a little bit as far as the grip goes. But again, they're Blizzaks. This is set up for winter driving, so I totally expect that and don't blame it for that. But honestly, I can tell it has really nice flat handling. It's also a pretty lightweight, all things considered. These weigh about 3,525 pounds. And for a luxury sports coupe these days, I mean, these engineers would, you know, kill to have something that's 3,500 pounds. And you know, this was doing it. So that means that, you know, having this much power, having a 6-cylinder engine, but having, you know, this low center of gravity, the low drag coefficient, all that stuff, it really makes this feel very sporty. And I also have to say that this engine has an interesting sound to it, where it sounds, you know, kind of a little buzzier than I was expecting out of a 6-cylinder in the low RPMs. But then whenever you go up to those higher RPMs, like we were doing a minute ago there, it almost has like a Porsche kind of sound to it. I mean, that makes sense since they run, you know, flat 6 engines as well. But, you know, it just kind of gives us a unique vibe. And especially if you are someone who happens to be a Porsche fan, you know, you might really enjoy the fact that you have, you know, this 6-cylinder engine here. And, yeah, I mean, other things though, this road we're on now currently is generating a lot more road noise, so that's why you're hearing, you know, some more of that. But again, I just am really impressed with the refinement as far as the quietness, the smoothness, even like going over bumps and potholes. I mean, the roads these days aren't in very good shape, but this was really soaking them up nicely, and it does all that despite the fact that this was a lot less fancy than a lot of other vehicles that was competing with it at the time. Especially the main competitor, I think, was the Mitsubishi 3000 GT VR4 and the Dodge Stealth GT. And those had like 4-wheel steering, and I believe you could even get some type of like adaptive suspension on those way back then. This doesn't have any of that stuff. Supposedly you can get rear-wheel steer in Japan on these at some point, but in the US here you never were able to get that. So anyway, it just, you know, is a very impressive handler. It just blows me away. This would be such a nice daily driver, especially back then, but even these days, it holds up compared with modern, you know, luxurious daily drivers and stuff. I mean, yeah, things are a little more rattly in here, and maybe it's not quite as quiet as a modern vehicle, but it's not far off, and this still is such a nice thing to just cruise around in. And let's do another acceleration just for fun. Here we go. That power light just comes on immediately the second I floor it. Man, yeah, this thing, it pulls well. I mean, I'm looking down at the speedometer and I'm like, yeah, this thing's getting up to speed really nicely. I don't know, I'm really impressed with this thing. I think they did a great job with it. Obviously, I haven't driven all of its competitors from back then. Obviously, there's a lot of sweet stuff in this price bracket. I mean, we're talking like Mark IV Supras were coming onto the scene, you know, just a year later, 1993. I mean, you had the, you know, a Nissan 300CX in addition to the Mitsubishi 3000 GTs and all that. Now, a lot of those were still even more expensive than this. Still, for, you know, someone who back then even was looking for something a little bit cheaper than those, because a Mitsubishi 3000 GT back then comparably equipped to this would have been about $5 more. Adjusting for inflation, that'd be closer to about $10 more these days. And so for someone who wanted to save some money there, you know, I think that this is great if you're, especially again, not on the enthusiast side as much. You're wanting something a little bit more luxurious, but you still want strong power and great looks. I mean, this really was a sweet package, I think, all things considered. And other things about it that are pretty cool are that you have a limit slip differential in the back there, so it does, you know, do a really good job of putting the power down. You also have four-wheel independent suspension here in this thing, so, you know, it does definitely have, you know, the hardware underneath this thing to, you know, back up the good handling, in addition to just the low center of gravity and, you know, the lower weight. Yeah, but if you are somebody who was considering daily driving one of these things, just for fun, I'll mention that the fuel economy, at least the way it was rated back then, was 17 mpg in the city, 25 on the highway, which I also have to say I'm pretty impressed by for, you know, an old 6-cylinder engine that had this much power and stuff. You know, to be getting, you know, those types of numbers, you know, I think that's pretty good. Obviously, these days, you know, you have no problem with a naturally aspirated V6, you know, doing those kinds of numbers as well, or even a twin turbo V6 these days can probably muster that. But, you know, I think it also certainly helped to have that great, you know, low drag coefficient to give you, you know, some really solid fuel economy, considering the power here. And another thing to mention too about these things, if you are someone who would like to, you know, consider one of these at some point down the road as a collectible or just as a fun, you know, thing to play around with, they are tough to come by. So they made about 14,000 is what I saw for the US. They made about another 10,000 additionally for the rest of the world. So about 24,000 total, 14,000 here in the States. So they're going to be kind of hard to find. This 1992 model year was actually one of the most popular ones, of course, being, you know, brand new for this model year. And so as a result, they sold about 5,000 in this year, and then, you know, about 9,000 across the other, you know, 4 years of its production run, ending in 1997. And so, you know, they'll be tough to find, but if you can find one of these things, I mean, I think you can get a pretty good deal on them still these days. They haven't really skyrocketed like some of the other, you know, stuff out there that's competed with it, you know, during its time. And so it's still kind of underappreciated, I think, in a lot of ways. It's still kind of this hidden gem that, you know, I think deserves to be much higher in price, and I think eventually we'll get there. It's just a matter of time. But, you know, as of right now, you know, you can still get a great deal on one of these things, have a really fun, you know, collectible that you can still drive and enjoy, especially even all year round if you're not worried about, you know, rust and stuff. But then, you know, it could be something that could be very collectible down the road as well. Yeah, doing this corner here that I always do. Again, the roads are a little bit looser, but I mean, it really just handles all this stuff without a sweat. I mean, I'm not pushing it 10/10 or anything. You know, who knows how it would do in a track day, but as far as just spirited daily driving, I think it does very, very well. But yeah, now we're out here on the highway, just cruising at regular highway speeds. And, you know, you hear the engine a little bit there whenever you're, you know, just accelerating slightly, but I mean, it's a really nice cruiser. And if it didn't have this roof rack and the Blizzak tires, this thing would be even quieter. And so just really, that combined with this nice, soft, smooth ride, which really, I can't get over just how smooth this thing glides over pavement. I mean, all that just combines to make a really nice long-distance Grand Tourer, I'm sure. So yeah, but one fun other little thing I want to mention in regards to these things, obviously pricing is going to be all over the place these days, depending on the condition, the mileage, all those types of things. But as far as back then, you know, people complain about pricing of vehicles these days. This LSL trim, I believe, started around $28,000 back then. You'll be like, oh, see, you get a 6-cylinder engine and a really sweet coupe for $28,000. But that was in 1992. When you adjust it for inflation these days, a vehicle that would be $28,000 back then is going to come out to about $59,000 in current money. So basically $60,000 for something like this back then. And again, this was one of the ones on the cheaper end. Those Mitsubishi 3000 GTs and stuff, again, 5 or 10 grand more. And again, adjusted for inflation, you're talking about, you know, a $70,000 sports coupe with those 3000 GTs. And so, I mean, all this stuff was expensive back then. Don't think it wasn't, you know, just because the numbers are a little misleading these days. With inflation, you know, it's pretty impressive. This was an expensive car back then, and so that's why it had a very high bar. And that's why, like, Motor Week, for example, back in 1991 even mentioned that, like, the plastics in here are kind of cheap. And, you know, I mean, obviously there wasn't anything that had super high quality materials back in 1991, but when you look at a comparable, you know, German luxury vehicle of the time, you know, you will have some higher quality stuff than what you had in some of these Japanese vehicles that were trying to be luxurious back then. But, you know, again, it doesn't really matter that much. I just think that the interior styling is so cool, the exterior styling is so unique, and it's also worth noting these windows, even though you do this, you know, split window kind of thing, you might think it would be a pain to live with, this opens up actually a good bit so that supposedly, from what I read on forums and stuff, it's a little bit easier to manage through drive-thrus and things like that, toll booths, compared to, you know, like a DeLorean or something like that, or even a Countach that has a similar setup. This is a much better opening, so it's definitely easier to live with, I think. Another fun little thing to note here is that it was actually rumored that even with that, you know, very high pricing back then, they actually, supposedly Subaru was rumored to have lost about $3,000 for every one of these that they sold. And again, adjusted for inflation, we're talking about they lost about $6 grand for each one of these things that they sold. So, you know, even though it had very high pricing, you know, it still probably wasn't ever profitable for Subaru. So it's amazing they honestly even kept it around for 5 years. But even though it did have the very cool styling, the very cool interior, and the very luxurious, you know, ride and all that, I can also see why these would have been a hard sell for Subaru back then. You know, I mean, it's very expensive. It was, you know, way more expensive than any other Subaru of its day, and, you know, people weren't used to spending this much money for a Subaru. I mean, even these days, you try selling someone a $60,000 Subaru, they still aren't trying to do that anymore. So, I mean, it was kind of something that didn't work out back then, and I think Subaru learned their lesson. They're never trying that again, and that's why I think the highest Subaru you can probably find is maybe a loaded up Ascent these days for, you know, $45,000 or something like that. And aside from the, you know, the S209 version, the STI, which maybe would hit 60, you know, otherwise they've never done any kind of mass-produced vehicle that was ever this expensive ever again. So I can certainly, you know, see that that was an uphill battle. Also, even though the other competitors were more expensive, they also had much higher performance. And so if you were someone who, you know, was already spending 60, if you're willing to go up to 70 for a 3000 GT VR4, for example, you know, you'd have a twin turbo V6, and you have all the other stuff with, you know, like I said, the suspension, the four-wheel steering, all those things. You know, for 10 grand more in modern money, you know, for a lot of people that was probably worthwhile to spend that extra 10. And so another thing that probably, you know, made it a little bit tough to sell the SVX here. But I'm still just respect Subaru for trying, and, you know, the ambition they had back then is just something, you know, you don't see quite as much of these days from other car companies, or even Subaru for that matter. And so I gotta respect them for doing this thing. It's just so cool that this thing exists. I'm just very grateful to have had a chance to drive one here now. A huge thanks to Alex for letting me review his here. Make sure to follow his Instagram if you want to follow his journey. He has this, and he also has some other very interesting vehicles as well that he owns and drives. So definitely check him out on Instagram there if you're curious to follow along on his journey with this car and his collection. Thank you all very much for watching. Please leave a like, comment, and subscribe to keep these videos coming. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.